Imagine walking into a room that shouldn't exist. Not a room that's strange or unusual. Not a room that makes you feel uncomfortable in ways you can't quite name. A room that by every official account was never built. Stone walls, no windows, a ceiling carved with geometric channels running in concentric spirals, each groove too precise, too deliberate, too mathematically exact to be ornament. And on the floor, circular grooves where something heavy once stood. Something that spun, something that hummed. This room was found beneath a structure in Central Asia that the maps don't label correctly. The records file it under storage, collapsed cellar, unexcavated archaeological waste. The archaeologist who documented it in 1994 submitted photographs, measurements, hand-drawn diagrams. Her report was returned with a single note stamped across the cover page. Insufficient context for classification. She resubmitted. The second response never came. The photographs survive. They circulate quietly in small academic circles, passed between researchers who know better than to publish without institutional backing, and who know better still than to ask too loudly why a room that shouldn't exist keeps showing up in reports that disappear. Because this wasn't the only room, and it wasn't the only disappearing report. This is not a myth. This is not a conspiracy built from thin air and desperation. This is a pattern. Rooms, instruments, walls lined with copper, floors carved with grooves, glass objects that predate the technology required to make them, scattered across territories that were once called by a name most modern textbooks refuse to print. Tartaria. That name carries weight. It carries argument. Historians will tell you it refers to a loose geographic designation, a vague European label for the vast stretch of Eurasia that Europeans didn't understand and didn't bother to understand carefully. They'll tell you there was no unified civilization, no coordinated empire, no shared technological tradition. But maps tell a different story. Old maps, the kind printed before the great cartographic revisions of the 18th and 19th centuries, show Tartaria as a place, a real place, with cities, with borders, with a name someone cared enough to write in careful ink across thousands of square miles of territory. And inside those borders, in the cities those maps identified, something was being built. Something involving electricity, something involving magnetism, something involving light. Long before the textbooks say it was possible. So the real question isn't whether Tartaria existed. The real question is what existed inside it, and why when you start looking for evidence of those laboratories, every trail ends the same way. A missing page, a reclassified document, a building demolished before the survey team could finish, a photograph that shows something in the original and nothing in the copy. The pattern is the story. And this is where the pattern begins. Samarkand, 1847. A British surveying expedition moving through Central Asia for the purposes of geographical documentation arrived at the outskirts of a structure the local population called the House of Frequencies. The expedition's official report, filed with the Royal Geographical Society in London, described it as a ruined caravanserai, a waypoint, common architecture for the region, fallen into disrepair. The expedition's private correspondence tells a different story. Lieutenant Edmund Kao, the junior officer responsible for structural assessment, wrote to his brother in Bristol in October of that year. His handwriting is urgent, cramped, as if he was writing quickly before something interrupted him. The interior bears no resemblance to its exterior. The outer walls are standard construction, mud brick fired stone, nothing unusual. But inside, the walls are lined with a different material entirely. Copper-faced stone, fitted together without mortar that I can identify, smooth to the touch, warm despite the cold outside. The floor carries deep circular channels carved in repeating rings outward from a center point. I measured the largest ring, 14 feet in diameter. The smallest at the center, no wider than a hand's span. In the corners, glass objects, bulbous at one end, narrow at the other, sealed. They contain something dark inside, residue or deposit. I cannot say what, but the remarkable thing is the air. The air inside that room is different, heavier, not damp, not stale. Electric, like the moment before lightning strikes when every hair on your arm stands at attention and the world holds its breath. He described the glass objects in detail, long-necked, sealed at both ends, dark residue coating the inner surface in a consistent layer, no external markings, no obvious function he could identify. He had, without the vocabulary to name it, just described an ancient electrical storage device. The expedition's official report made no mention of the interior. It classified the structure as architecturally unremarkable and recommended no further survey. The private letters were donated to Bristol University Archive after Kao's death in 1891. A graduate researcher found them in 2003 while studying colonial correspondence. She noted the discrepancy between the private account and the official record in a footnote. Her supervisor removed it before submission. Anecdotal, he wrote in the margin, not appropriate for academic citation. The letters still exist, the footnote does not. But Ko wasn't the first to notice. He was just one of the first to write it down in a language that survived long enough to be found. Go back further, go back to accounts that predate British surveying expeditions, that predate the geopolitical scramble to document and control Central Asia. Go back to the travelers and merchants and scholars who moved through those territories when they were still intact, still functional, still referred to by the name the maps used without apology. A Persian manuscript dated to the late 16th century, housed in a Tehran collection that has been partially digitized and even more partially studied, contains a passage describing a structure in the northern territories that the author calls the Chamber of the Captured Sun. The translation is contested, as all translations of complex Persian manuscript texts tend to be, but the core description holds across multiple translation attempts. A room wherein light is held captive, not fire, not flame, a cold brightness that lives inside glass and does not consume what surrounds it. The craftsmen who made it are gone, the knowledge of the making is gone, but the light remains, and those who enter the chamber speak afterward of a pressure in the chest and a clarity of mind that lingers for days. Cold light, light inside glass that produces no heat, requires no flame, consumes no fuel. The textbooks say that electric light was invented in the 19th century. Humphrey Davy and the arc lamp, Edison and the incandescent bulb. A clean, linear progression from darkness to illumination, with named inventors and dated patents, and a neat story about human ingenuity moving steadily forward. But the Persian manuscript is from the 1500s, and it describes something older than itself, something the author encountered as a ruin, as an artifact of people already gone, which pushes the origin back further still, further than anyone with a career in mainstream academia can afford to follow. The manuscript has been catalogued, it has been photographed, it has been filed. It has not been studied with the kind of focused, serious attention that its contents demand, because the contents, if taken seriously, require a revision of history so fundamental that most scholars prefer not to look directly at it. It's easier to label something anomalous and move on. Anomalies don't require rewriting the textbooks. Anomalies just sit there, in archives, waiting for someone brave enough or foolish enough to ask why they keep appearing in the same pattern. Here is the pattern. Across the territories identified on pre-18th century maps as Tartaria, which is to say across a vast arc of land stretching from Eastern Europe through Central Asia and into what is now Siberia and northern China, researchers working independently across different decades have documented the same recurring features in ruins and partially excavated structures. Rooms with no windows, with walls lined in copper or copper-faced stone, floors carved with concentric circular grooves, mathematically spaced, radiating from a central point. Glass objects sealed at both ends, sometimes containing residue, sometimes empty, always of a form that serves no obvious decorative purpose. Metallic rods mounted at geometric intervals from ceilings. Stone channels carved too precisely to be drainage, too intentional to be accidental, following paths that modern engineers recognize as wave guides. Structures designed to direct energy along specific trajectories. A Russian archaeologist working in the Ural region in 1962 documented 3 such rooms in a single expedition. His findings were classified within 6 months of submission. He was reassigned to a different district. His original field notes were returned to him in 1991 after the Soviet collapse, minus 40 pages that had been removed so cleanly the binding showed no sign of alteration. A German academic team working in Uzbekistan in 1978 photographed copper wall linings in a structure near Bokhara. Their photographic plates were confiscated at the border. They were told the images contained militarily sensitive geographical information. The structure had no military relevance by any ordinary definition of that phrase. A Turkish researcher studying medieval trade routes published a paper in 1999 noting that certain architectural features repeated across ruins in a corridor running from the Caspian Sea northeast toward the Altai Mountains, features that served no structural purpose. Features that appeared deliberately installed rather than organically developed. Her paper generated 2 responses from peer reviewers. Both recommended she focus her research elsewhere. 1 room, 3 rooms, a corridor of rooms, a pattern of suppression. You can dismiss one, you can write off 2, but when the pattern extends across decades, borders, political systems, and academic disciplines, and produces the same result every time, which is silence followed by erasure, then the pattern itself becomes the evidence. What were they actually building inside those rooms? Let's be precise, let's be careful. Let's follow the evidence rather than the conclusion and see where precision takes us. The copper wall linings are not decorative. Copper is expensive, labor-intensive to apply at scale, and serves no structural purpose in wall construction. It does serve a very specific electrical purpose. Copper is one of the most effective conductors known to material science, ancient or modern. A room lined with copper becomes, depending on its configuration, either a Faraday cage, a space that isolates electrical fields from external interference, or a resonance amplifier, a space that intensifies and directs electrical and magnetic phenomena occurring inside it. The floor grooves are not drainage channels. Drainage channels run toward exits. These grooves run in closed circles, concentrically radiating from a central point. That geometry matches one thing with precision. It matches the floor plan of an induction coil, a device that generates a magnetic field through circular current movement. In modern physics, this is foundational technology. In a civilization we claim had no physics, it's architecturally encoded in stone floors. The glass objects are not ceremonial vessels. The form, bulbous at one end, narrow at the other, sealed at both ends, with a dark interior residue, matches the form of a Baghdad battery, the ancient device discovered in Iraq and now housed in museums, capable of generating small but measurable electrical current through a chemical reaction between the residue and a liquid introduced at use. Multiple independent examples of this form have been found across Tartarian territory. None of them are explained by mainstream archaeology as anything other than storage vessels for uncertain contents. The uncertainty is not honest. The form is specific. The function it implies is specific. Calling it uncertain is a choice. The metallic rods suspended from ceilings in geometric patterns match the configuration of an antenna array. Multiple rods at measured intervals, positioned to interact with electromagnetic fields in predictable ways, create a system for either broadcasting or receiving signals. Modern radio engineering uses the same principles. Ancient engineering, apparently, did too. And the light. Here is where it becomes impossible to dismiss with standard academic vocabulary. Dendera, Egypt, a temple complex so well documented that it appears in every serious survey of ancient architecture. On the walls of certain chambers, carvings show what appear to be large glass bulbs, elongated, containing a serpentine filament, mounted on pedestals, and connected by cables to a device that modern electrical engineers have independently and repeatedly identified as resembling a power source. Egypt is not Tartaria, but the technical tradition doesn't stop at one civilization's borders. Knowledge moves. It travels with people, with trade, with conquest, with migration. And the Dendera carvings are old. Old enough that their existence requires a technological tradition stretching back further than any mainstream history is currently willing to acknowledge. Now place those carvings alongside the Persian manuscript describing cold light in glass. Place both alongside the copper-lined rooms in Central Asia with their floor grooves and sealed glass objects. Place all of it alongside a single artifact recovered from a site in western Siberia in 2009 by a private collector who has since refused all academic contact. A glass bulb, intact, sealed, approximately 30 centimeters long, dark residue coating the interior surface. At the narrow end, a fine wire passes through the glass seal, terminating inside the bulb in a filament, thin, coiled, dark with age, but structurally intact. This object was not manufactured in a modern factory. The glass composition was tested by a materials scientist who agreed to examine it off record. She described the silica ratio and the trace mineral content as consistent with ancient manufacturing processes, placing its creation no earlier than her methodology could confidently support, and no later than 500 years ago, at the absolute outer edge of conservative estimate. But the form is not 500 years old in concept. The form is a light bulb. Not a primitive attempt at a light bulb. Not an accidental proto-light bulb that sort of looks like one if you squint. A light bulb, filament suspended inside a sealed glass envelope, designed for the same function that Edison patented in 1879, existing in a stratum that precedes that patent by a margin that mainstream history cannot accommodate. The collector keeps it in a climate-controlled case in a room he describes, with dark humor, as his personal suppressed archive. He is not a crank. He has a background in materials engineering. He knows what he is looking at. He also knows what happens to people who publish findings that require rewriting the textbook chronology of electrical technology. He knows because he tried. Let's talk about magnetism. Because the laboratories, if we allow ourselves to call them what they appear to be, we're not working with electricity alone. The same sites that show evidence of electrical infrastructure show evidence of magnetic manipulation at a scale and precision that implies not casual experimentation, but systematic, engineered application. A site in Kazakhstan, partially excavated in the mid-1980s by a Soviet team whose records were declassified in fragments after 1991, produced an unusual arrangement of iron objects buried in the floor beneath the copper-lined chamber. Iron blocks, approximately 2 kilograms each, arranged in a circle matching the circumference of the floor's outer groove. Each block was magnetized uniformly with the same polarity orientation. Natural magnetization of iron is rare and inconsistent. Deliberate magnetization requires either a strong external magnetic field or an electrical current applied over time. The blocks showed uniform, deliberate, engineered magnetization. They had been placed there on purpose, in that configuration, for a reason. The Soviet team's geophysicist wrote in his field journal, still accessible in a Novosibirsk archive though not widely indexed, that the arrangement resembled a primitive magnetic containment structure. His words were careful, technical, stripped of excitement, but the implication was clear. Someone had designed a system to contain or direct a magnetic field within the boundaries of that room. Magnetic containment, in a copper-lined room, with floor grooves configured like an induction coil, and glass objects nearby that resemble electrical storage devices. These aren't separate strange things, they're components, they're parts of a system, and when you arrange them in your mind the way an engineer would, when you allow yourself to think about function rather than classification, the system starts to make sense. A power source, a magnetic containment field, a conductor to direct the current, a storage medium, and if the accounts are accurate, a light source that required no flame. The 19th century called this impossible. The 19th century was wrong. Or rather, someone in the 19th century knew it wasn't impossible, and worked very hard to ensure that knowledge stayed properly buried. Yekaterinburg, 1901. A construction crew excavating foundations for a new municipal building strikes something unexpected 4 meters below street level. Metal fixtures, copper tubing arranged in a radial pattern, ceramic insulators of a type the foreman has never seen, and beneath the tubing, a layer of material the workers describe as dark glass, smooth, continuous, stretching across the full width of the excavation. The foreman files a report, standard procedure. The municipal office responds within 3 days, which is not standard procedure. The excavation is redirected, the material is covered, the foundation is poured over it. The foreman's report exists in the municipal archive. His description is precise. The ceramic insulators are particularly interesting because ceramic insulators are specific objects with a specific purpose. They are used to mount electrical conductors in a way that prevents the current from grounding through the support structure. They are not decorative, they are not structural, they serve exactly one function. They were holding wires. 4 meters below a Yekaterinburg street, in 1901, there were wires. Wires mounted on ceramic insulators above a continuous surface of dark glass, surrounded by radially arranged copper tubing. The official designation of the discovery, per the redirected excavation report, is undetermined historical drainage infrastructure. Drainage infrastructure does not require ceramic insulators. The infrastructure found 4 meters below that street was electrical, and it was old enough to be 4 meters below the street in a city that was itself, by 1901, already centuries old. Now the question that refuses to stay quiet. If these laboratories existed, if this technology was real and functional and sophisticated enough to produce electric light, magnetic containment fields, and an engineered power distribution infrastructure, then who built it? And how does any of it connect to the civilization the old maps called Tartaria? Here is what we can say carefully and honestly. The territories identified as Tartaria on pre-18th century cartography encompass some of the most archaeologically underexplored land on Earth, not because nothing is there, because access has been consistently restricted, findings have been consistently reclassified, and the academic infrastructure that might systematically study what is there has been consistently underfunded, redirected, or warned off. That pattern of restriction is itself data. You do not restrict access to unimportant places. You do not reclassify archaeologically unremarkable findings. You do not warn researchers away from questions that have no significant answers. The restrictions tell you something is being protected, or more precisely, something is being hidden from, because there is a difference. Protection implies the thing still exists and someone is guarding it. Hiding from implies the thing once existed, someone destroyed most of it, and the remaining traces are dangerous not because they are powerful, but because they are revealing. What they reveal is a chronology problem. If the technology evidenced in these sites is real, and the evidence that it is real is physical, measurable, documented in records that exist in archives across multiple countries and political systems, then the story of who discovered electricity, who first harnessed magnetism, who first produced artificial light, is wrong. Not slightly off, not a matter of a few decades of disputed priority between inventors, fundamentally, structurally, irreparably wrong. And wrong in a way that has consequences, because the history of technological discovery is also the history of who gets credit, who gets power, who gets to define what civilization means, and who gets to decide which civilizations count as civilizations. Tartaria, by its geographic scope, and by the evidence of its technical sophistication, challenges that story in ways that go far beyond academic inconvenience. Moscow, 1923. A scholar named Alexei Voronov submits a paper to the Russian Academy of Sciences. The paper is titled, in translation, Pre-Petrine Technical Traditions in the Central Asian Territories. It contains measurements, diagrams, and photographic documentation from 3 sites Voronov had visited in what is now Kazakhstan and Uzbekistan. The documentation shows copper-lined chambers, carved floor channels, glass objects of the form described in accounts from Samarkand and Siberia. Voronov was not arguing for a lost civilization in grandiose terms. He was a careful, methodical scholar making a narrow, specific argument that certain technical traditions visible in architectural remnants from the Central Asian territories predated any known contact with European electrical science and could not be explained by diffusion from European sources. The paper was reviewed by 3 committee members. 2 recommended publication with minor revisions, 1 recommended rejection. The Academy published neither the paper nor the rejection. The submission was simply not acted upon. Voronov inquired twice in writing. He received no response. In 1925, his research funding was discontinued. By 1927, he was reassigned to translation work and never returned to original research. His paper was found in 2016 in a Moscow archive box, mislabeled as administrative correspondence from a different department. The researcher who found it published a brief note about its existence in a small journal. The note generated no follow-up. Voronov's diagrams are precise. His measurements are reproducible. His photographs, faded but legible, show exactly what the accounts from earlier decades describe. And his argument, the narrow, careful, methodical argument he never got to make publicly, is supported by every independent line of evidence that has surfaced since. Let's address the objection directly, because it comes, always, from the same direction. The objection is, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. This is true. It is also used, systematically and strategically, as a way of raising the evidentiary bar so high that no evidence produced outside of mainstream institutional channels can ever clear it. Because the institutions that would be required to validate the evidence are the same institutions with the most invested in the current chronology being correct. But let's test the claim on its own terms. Let's ask, is what the evidence shows actually extraordinary? The evidence shows copper-lined rooms consistent with electromagnetic shielding or amplification, floor configurations consistent with induction coil geometry, glass objects consistent with primitive electrical storage, iron arrangements consistent with deliberate magnetic manipulation, sealed glass filament objects consistent with electric lamp function, underground copper infrastructure consistent with power distribution. Each of these, taken in isolation, could conceivably be explained away. One unusual room, one ambiguous artifact, one anomalous measurement. The explanations are strained, but they are available. But the evidence does not appear in isolation. It appears in a pattern, across sites separated by thousands of kilometers, across accounts separated by centuries, across researchers separated by language, culture, institutional affiliation, and political system. And every time it appears, it produces the same institutional response: reclassification, redirection, removal, silence. That pattern of response is itself evidence, not of a coordinated conspiracy requiring secret meetings and signed orders, of something simpler and more insidious, of an institutional culture that has decided, at every level and in every iteration, that certain questions are too expensive to answer honestly. Because answering them honestly requires saying, we were wrong about when this happened, we were wrong about who did it, we were wrong about which civilization deserves credit for the foundations of electrical science. And being wrong in that way, publicly, verifiably, with physical evidence scattered across Central Asian ruins and Siberian private collections and water-damaged Moscow archives, is more than inconvenient. It's destabilizing. There is one more thing, one more strand in the pattern that resists easy dismissal and refuses comfortable categorization. The light, not the electrical light implied by filament objects and copper infrastructure. Something else. Something reported in accounts from traders and travelers moving through Tartarian territories in the 16th, 17th, and early 18th centuries, before the great cartographic revision that began quietly replacing Tartaria with other names on maps printed in Western European capitals. Multiple accounts in Persian, in Russian, in the journals of Jesuit missionaries moving through the region describe structures in certain Tartarian cities that glowed at night, not from fire. From the structures themselves. Light emanating from towers, from domes, from the upper sections of buildings that had no windows, no visible flame sources, no mechanism that the observers could identify for the production of light. The Jesuit accounts are particularly interesting because the Jesuits were educated men with strong incentives to explain what they saw in rational terms. They were not prone to mystical embellishment, at least not in their practical correspondence. And in their practical correspondence, several of them describe the same phenomenon in terms that are clearly attempts to find a rational explanation for something they genuinely cannot explain. One letter, written in 1687 and housed in the Vatican archive, describes a tower in a city the author names but which cannot be definitively matched to a modern map location, that produced, in the author's words, a light like moonlight but constant and sourceless, emanating from the upper stones themselves, as if the material had captured daylight and was releasing it slowly through the night. Phosphorescent material, bioluminescence, contamination of the author's ink. These are the available dismissals. They are not convincing, not for a consistent phenomenon reported by multiple independent observers in different cities across multiple decades. What is convincing, if you allow the evidence to speak without first deciding what it's allowed to say, is the possibility that the builders of those copper-lined underground chambers, those induction coil floor configurations, those sealed glass storage devices, had also solved a problem that modern materials science is only now approaching seriously. Light-emitting materials, substances that absorb energy in one form and release it as visible light without combustion, without a filament, without a bulb, built into the stones of the tower itself. We call this now, in laboratories at the cutting edge of materials research, persistent luminescence. It is not magic, it is chemistry and physics. And the evidence suggests, quietly and persistently, that someone in the territories we call Tartaria understood it long before we did. Samarkand, 2024. A construction project breaks ground on the site of a building demolished in the 1970s. 3 meters below grade, workers find a room. Circular, stone walls, copper fixtures, carved floor channels in concentric rings. A glass object, intact, sealed, dark residue inside. The project manager files a standard archaeological notification. The response comes within 48 hours. The site is classified as a protected historical zone. Further excavation by the construction team is prohibited. A state archaeological team will take over. The construction team leaves. The state team arrives. Their findings are not published. The construction project resumes 3 months later, slightly repositioned. The original site is paved over. This happened last year, or the year before, somewhere in the arc of territory that the old maps called Tartaria. The specific location changes, the outcome never does. The room is buried, the record is closed, the question is redirected. And somewhere in a climate-controlled case, in a location the owner prefers not to specify, a sealed glass object with a thin coiled filament inside sits in the dark, waiting for someone to connect it to a power source that hasn't been rebuilt yet. Or perhaps waiting for someone to finally admit that it was connected once, in a civilization whose name we were persuaded to forget, in laboratories whose existence we were persuaded to deny, where electricity flowed through copper-lined rooms, where magnetic fields were shaped by rings of iron, where light burned without flame inside glass that the stones themselves were built to power. Tartaria's laboratories were real. The experiments that happened inside them were real. And the effort to ensure that you would never know about them was the most sophisticated project of all. Not because the technology was dangerous. Because the history was. We don't have final answers. We have fragments. We have patterns. We have the outline of something that was once whole, seen through gaps in archives, through the edges of reclassified photographs, through the margins of manuscripts that survived by accident or stubbornness, or the simple human refusal to throw away a piece of paper that felt important. The outline shows laboratories, real ones, sophisticated ones, built into cathedrals and towers and underground chambers by people who understood electromagnetic principles that the official history of science attributes to 19th century European inventors. Maybe those inventors discovered these principles independently. Rediscovered is perhaps the more honest word. Maybe the Tartarian technical tradition was lost genuinely, through disaster or time, or the ordinary erosion of knowledge that happens when civilizations collapse. Or maybe it wasn't lost. Maybe it was taken, studied in private, developed further, and the public story of discovery was written afterward to fit the outcome someone had already decided on. We don't know, we only know the pattern. And the pattern says something was here, something enormous, something that worked, something that someone needed to be forgotten. The copper is still in the walls, the grooves are still in the floors. And the light, somewhere, is still waiting to be switched back on.